A bond is a big loan. If a person wants to borrow big money, they issue a bond. The borrower is the issuer, and the lender is the buyer of the bond or the investor. Here is a bond that has the amount $100,000 printed in the contract. That's called the face amount. That's the amount that is going to be paid back, but that's not necessarily the amount that is received when borrowing. Bonds bear interest. This bond bears interest at 8% and pays interest semi-annually. That means every 6 months. The term is 5 years. That means that it will pay interest every 6 months for 5 years. 2 times a year, that's 10 interest payments. Now, along with the last interest payment, this bond will pay back the face amount of $100,000. To be clear, this bond pays 9 payments of $4,000, and the last payment is $104,000. Total payout $140,000. But that doesn't mean that somebody is going to pay you anything near $140,000 when they buy the bond. They're going to pay something around $100,000, but not usually exactly $100,000. They could pay a little more or a little less, because you need to think of these bonds as being continuously sold minute after minute. And there is an auction of buyers. And sometimes the buyers are in a crowded auction and they bid the price up. And if there's a big crowd of people trying to buy the bond, then they'll usually buy it for more than $100,000. But if there's not very many people trying to buy the bonds at any given moment, then the price might go lower than $100,000. If somebody pays more than $100,000, that's called the bond selling for a premium. If somebody pays less than $100,000, they bought it at a discount. Okay, here are the journal entries. Let's look at the left at the journal. We issue the bond for face amount. We receive $100,000 in cash, so we debit cash. And we always credit bonds payable for the face amount. 6 months later, we have to pay interest. We debit interest expense and we credit cash. And we repeat that every 6 months. Now, skip down to the bottom. 5 years later, we're going to do another interest payment, but we're also going to pay the face amount of this bond. So that's why we're adding a debit to bonds payable to cancel that payable off our books. And the total cash we pay on that last date is $104,000. Here's the same bond if it were sold at a discounted price. This bond was sold for $98,000, so you debit cash for the amount of cash you received. You always have to credit bonds payable for the face, whatever that is. In this case, we credit bonds payable for $100,000. To make the journal entry balance, we plug a debit of $2,000, and we'll call that bond discount. That bond discount is a bit of a problem. We have to take that off the books. We have to amortize that off the books over the next 5 years. It's as easy as depreciating equipment using the straight line method. So every time we make an interest payment, we are going to amortize a little bit of that $2,000 off the books. So in bold, you see 6 months later, we are going to credit the bond discount for $200, and we'll debit interest expense. How did I get the $200? Well, I'm using what's called the straight line method, just like depreciating equipment, but we call this amortizing because it's an intangible asset. And we're going to take the total amount, $2,000, and systematically remove it off the books over 60 months, because there are 60 months in 5 years, and 6 months have just passed. So that is the proportion of the 5 years that we want to remove from the books every 6 months. And we just do that every time we make an interest payment. I just want to point something out to you here. In the last slide, on the left here, this is what I did. There's 2 separate journal entries, one for the recognition of interest expense and the other for the amortization of the bond discount. These are 2 separate pieces of logic, and so I wrote 2 different journal entries. But many textbooks don't write it that way. They combined the 2 debits to interest expense into one line item. I don't prefer to show it that way because as I'm explaining it, I have 2 separate pieces of logic to explain, and I like to keep them separate. Take your pick. Both are acceptable. Here is a bond sold for more than face. We received $104,000, so we debit cash for the amount of cash we received. We credit bonds payable always for the face amount that we have to pay back. The difference we plug to a credit, and we call that bond premium. That bond premium has to be amortized off our books over 5 years. So every 6 months, we're going to take a chunk of that off the books. Bond premium has a credit balance, so we will debit bond premium every 6 months, and we will credit interest expense because the amortization of bond premiums or discounts are adjustments of the interest expense account. And we'll do that each time, each 6 months. And then at the end, we'll remember to pay back the face amount. Okay, I just want to point out again that there's 2 pieces of logic. I made 2 journal entries. Many textbooks combine the 2 interest expense items into one line item. Take your pick.